perspective that we can gain from a leader who has been there and done that is exquisite, especially when they have, for so many years, taught others what they've learned. Today is one of those days. Sit back and enjoy, but have a pen and paper ready too. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live. Well, you could be with us live in the future. And to find out when we're going live and what's up with all of that, you can join us on one of our two social media channels. You can join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to get all of that inside info and to join us in the future. Today's episode is brought to you by the second edition of our new book, The Long Distance Leader, Revised Rules for Remarkable Remote and Hybrid Leadership. If you lead a team that is distributed in any way, this book will give you new skills, insights, and the confidence to lead more effectively in this new and still changing world of work. Learn more and order your copy by going to remarkablepodcast.com/LDL. And with that, I'm going to bring in my guest, and here he is. I will introduce him, and then I will kind of get out of the way a little bit so we can have a conversation. Willie Pietersen was raised in South Africa, now lives in New York, and received a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, the second person on this show to have been a Rhodes Scholar. After practicing law, he embarked on an international business career. Over a period of 20 years, he served as the CEO of multibillion-dollar businesses such as Lever Brothers Foods Division, Seagram USA, Tropicana, and Sterling Winthrop's Consumer Health Group. In 1998, he was named Professor of the Practice of Management at the Columbia University Graduate School of Business. He specializes in strategy and the leadership of change. He has served as an advisor to many organizations in both the commercial and not-for-profits fields. He's with us today because of his brand new book, Leadership, The Inside Story, Time-Tested Prescriptions for Those Who Seek to Lead. It is now available, and Willie is our guest. And welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.
It is my pleasure. And let's see, we've got someone. Oh, I know who that person is. Good morning to you as well. So let's start here. So you worked as a senior leader for many years successfully, and then you decided to stop doing that and start teaching. How did you end up making that decision? And I guess, why did you decide that you wanted to teach what you had been so long practicing?
I'd always had a passion for learning, and I think that teaching is the most powerful way ever invented to learn. So that's number one, just as a kind of a passion that I had. And the second is that sometimes when you have a passion for something, opportunities land in your lap and you have to recognize them. So the company I was running was a subsidiary of Kodak, and Kodak eventually, as you might know, went insolvent. But before they did, they asked us to sell the subsidiary, which was a thriving business. And we did, and we sold it successfully. Having then run businesses for 20 years, the next question arose, that you often like to pose, is now what? Now what? And so I thought back a little bit to a visit that the dean at Columbia Business School had paid when I was running Seagram's USA business. And he came to lunch on a fundraising visit. And he said, by the way, we'd love to have executives teach on our program from time to time. Would you show up and run a case study? And I said, well, sure. And I did a few of those. So when the moment came that I thought, what happens next? I thought back on that experience and called up the dean. We had coffee, and he said, why don't you come aboard and have a go? And I got a little warning from a colleague there, because he said, well, meet some of these seasoned professionals here, professors, and get some guidance on what you might expect. And the first thing that was said to me was, when senior executives come in here and try and teach, 80% of them fail. And I said, well, thank you for the warning, right?
I'm going to be in the 20%.
Right. So kind of where I belong. But I realized it's a shift. And you can't just say, because I was successful, we all have setbacks along the way. As a CEO, I would automatically be successful as a teacher. You have to learn your way to success. And that was a kind of an interesting journey for me as well. And then it began to work out pretty well. And I've thoroughly enjoyed that new journey.
And so now there's another journey because now you've written a book. And so tell us a little bit about that. And obviously we're going to spend our conversation talking about some of the stuff in the book, the leadership, the inside story, time-tested prescriptions for those who seek to lead. We're going to go into that. But I'm curious why that journey, because it's another set of skills. You and I talked about that a little bit before we went live, to write. So do the work of leading, teach the work of leading, and now write about it. Why did you decide to write the book?
Well, I'd written 2 prior books. They were concentrated on strategy because I've done a lot of strategy work. I teach strategy, etc., as a basic skill. And I began to realize, first of all, that strategy is an essential part of leadership. It's not a separate activity. It's an integral part of the way we lead, but it's only one part of it, not the totality. So that was one kind of realization, that I needed to broaden the perspective that I offer to put strategy into its proper context as a domain of leadership at large. Now, the second thing that happened is I'd been writing a number of blogs that had been running on Columbia platforms. There were about 20 of them. And one day at lunch, my wife, who's a writer and a very creative spirit, said to me, you've already written a book. I said, well, no, I haven't. She said, it's all in those blogs. Those ideas that you've laid out in your blogs, you need to thread them together. There's some rich ideas there, and offer them. And I looked back and I said, well, maybe there is. And I went to work on it. And the book was born that way. My wife was my cheerleader, I guess. That was it. And I don't find writing, I don't know about you, I know you've written a book, at least one. It's not a natural skill to me. I find it hard work to do. And I pore over sentences and words and meanings, etc.
And we had this whole conversation about grammar, you and I.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I always say it's like giving birth to an elephant. It's much more enjoyable to see the end product than to actually go through the process of writing it. But anyway, there it is. It's done. And it captured all this material from what I call my lifelong learning laboratory. What I learned growing up in South Africa, what I learned about growing up under the apartheid regime there, what I learned about kind of viewing something with a mind that had been imprinted at the beginning as a child, with what seemed to be that's the way the world worked, separation of the races, and then learning gradually and overcoming that kind of locked-in bias. That was one sort of learning laboratory, and gained a lot of inspiration and learning from Nelson Mandela and what he did to achieve a peaceful transition to democracy in that troubled, race-driven country. Then the next learning journey, of course, part of my learning laboratory was being in the action field, like you were when you worked at Chevron and so on.
Yep.
Actually doing it and running into realities, figuring out how to do it better, realizing you don't know it all. You have to keep learning and learning from other perspectives. And then, of course, the learning laboratory of actually teaching and consulting with a number of businesses. So, I've been lucky to have that kind of laboratory of learning that is kind of like a kaleidoscope, encompassing a broad range of perspectives and issues, and then bringing that together in the book.
Well, with that context, that tells us a little bit about the book. We've gotten to know a little bit about you, Willie, in the last few minutes, which is fantastic. And what I want to do is just sort of pick out a few of the things in the book that I thought were interesting and useful, but I thought that would lead to a fruitful conversation for the two of us. So I'm just going to sort of poke around and pick around at some ideas there. But before we do that, and I don't know that you answered this question in the book. I don't recall it specifically. So I'm just going to ask you this sort of big picture question first. What do you believe the most important work of a leader is? What's the most important work of a leader?
People work. Leadership is about people. Management is about things. I learned a key lesson early on in my very first appointment as a CEO. I was young. I was part of the Unilever group. I was put in charge of the foods business in South Africa. I'd practiced law prior to that, and I had a kind of very logical way of thinking. And I had started off with a kind of a theory of how it all should work. I regarded running a business like a game of chess, making all the right moves, doing all the analytical work, thinking about brand positioning, profitability ratios, and all of those kinds of analytical issues, stringing the logic together and believing that if you just express the logic to everybody, they would simply get very excited and follow the logic. After 3 months doing this role, my boss, CJ van Jaarsveld, wonderful guy, he was the chairman of the group, called me into his office and said, Pietersen, what has surprised you in your first 3 months as a CEO?
What a great question, by the way. Go ahead.
Question. Yeah, wonderful question. And I said, CJ, I was really amazed at how much time I've needed to spend on people issues, motivating them, making them feel relevant and important, including them, engaging them in what we're doing, getting buy-in from them, inspiring them. And I realized that just logic doesn't get me there. And first of all, he looked at me in a kind of a lingering way, and then a smile broke out on his face, and he said, Pietersen, welcome to leadership. That was my first, and I feel like, monumental lesson, that it's about the people. And if we don't understand that, it's not about exercising power. Leadership is about service. And it's not about just making great decisions and expecting people to follow them. It doesn't work like that.
So everybody, listen to Willie say that, and this is a guy who teaches strategic work. So like that, so hook those two things together, right? Because you start out by saying, hey, it's about playing chess, it's about making the right moves, it's about the strategy, and that's where you spend a lot of your time teaching and consulting, and yet connect that back to the people too.
It is. Now that leads me to the next step here. Realizing this importance of the people issue, realizing that you also need to be a good strategic leader. I began to construct a model, if you like, of what leadership essentially consists of. And this is under the kind of heading that if we want to be really good at something, we must really understand what it is, and give people a kind of a good fundamental understanding of what leadership is. And this is a Venn diagram that explains that leadership really consists of 3 essential domains. There it is in the book. Quite right. Thank you very much, Kevin. Yeah, you have it up there. And the first domain of leadership is leadership of self, is deep self-knowledge and being grounded in a set of principles that are morally sound, that guide your actions and inspire others. And this is the source of your leadership. It's kind of permission to lead. And this is, if you like, the foundation of your character. This is about self and understanding who you are, what you really believe in, and being steadfast about your principles. Second domain of leadership is strategic leadership, giving the organization a clear sense of direction, a winning way, and a shared set of priorities for success. You can't lead without that. And the third domain of leadership is interpersonal leadership, is bringing out the best in others. What I found useful about this is it makes us very intentional and say, well, we need to integrate these 3 domains because our role is to be integrated leaders. And if one of these domains of leadership is deficient in some way, it interferes with the totality. So it makes us very intentional about it. It's also a great way, I find, a diagnostic tool to reflect on our own effectiveness. Where are we falling short? Where should we put the pressure? And then we all need feedback from others, because we've got blind spots. And rather than saying to somebody, listen, please give me some honest feedback. How am I doing? It's a hopeless question. It's too big a question. How am I doing? Fine. All right. Thank you. So giving them the structure, saying, could you tell me, how am I doing on the personal leadership? Are my values clear and transparent to everybody? Am I consistent in my application of those? Am I very clear on strategic leadership? Is it expressed with simplicity? Did I engage people in creating the strategy? And the third is, how about the interpersonal aspects of leadership? How am I doing at that? So it enables people to give much more constructive feedback as well.
100%. So there's been like 3 times now that you've hinted at one of the skills that it takes to be a highly effective leader, and that's asking the right questions. And we're just talking about that in terms of asking questions that give you a better chance of actually getting useful feedback. But I'm curious, there's a chapter in the book about this, but like, what are a couple pieces of advice you have about asking the right questions in any given situation?
Yeah, this is huge. And I'm a great fan of Socrates here, because he turned the world upside down in terms of the way we learn. Prior to Socrates, the Greek philosopher, there were these characters called the sophists, who roamed around Greece and taught people the art of rhetoric, how to express yourself with, very impressively and persuade others. Socrates had a look at this and said, that doesn't work for me. I don't learn anything by repeating what I already know, and the audience doesn't learn much from what I just push at them. His mother was a midwife, and he looked at that as a metaphor. And he realized that she didn't give birth to babies, but she facilitated their delivery.
Yeah.
And he said, well, we're all looking for the best ideas. I'm a facilitator of delivering the best ideas. I don't offer them myself. I facilitate them. Now, I think that's a huge idea. And stepping back, I think we can say that everything we know in the world, in science or in general knowledge, comes from a question somebody asked. It doesn't just drop out of the blue sky. Science learns that way, learns with an hypothesis that says, I wonder whether this is true, and then tests it through experimentation. Always starts with a question.
Even if the apple falls onto your head, which dropped out of the sky, there's still a question that has to be asked.
Why did that happen?
Right. I love that metaphor of facilitating so very much. And when you think about being a facilitator, whether it's a pure facilitator or a facilitative leader, it all drives back to the process, making it easier for things to happen, which is the root word of to facilitate, is to make easier. And perhaps the single best way to do that is with the right kinds of questions. Is there a specific situation where you think leaders could be better, generally speaking, at asking questions? Because there's lots of places we can do it, right? Is there a time or a place when you're seeing leaders aren't as good at it as they really need to be?
Well, the right questions help people learn and give them enthusiasm for learning. They're not designed to trap people and expose ignorance. Now, I used to practice law, and questions in a courtroom, a cross-examination, are used as weapons. They're there to expose this kind of inconsistency, lying, whatever the case might be, lack of memory. Now, the kind of learning questions we're talking about are the opposite of weapons. They're invitations to learn. And having this skill and avoiding those kind of what I call gotcha questions, we're all familiar with them. You go to a meeting and you present something and you've been working on it for weeks, and there's a little gap in the logic, and somebody wants to outsmart you and says, but you haven't done an ROA calculation on this. And oops, I'm sorry. And now I'm on the defensive. I'm not going to learn anything. So instead of saying something more open-ended and inviting, is to say, what more do you think we need to know about this to enrich the information that we've got to make a better decision? What more do you think that we might do here? And invite people to have a discussion and gently lead somebody towards that conclusion to make them feel they're part of finding it. So it becomes a kind of a joint effort, a participative process. Now, I'll give you an example of a kind of question like that. And it's an example from the American War of Independence. For non-Americans on this podcast, my apologies, but it's a brief example. America fought a war of independence against the British rule. There were 13 independent colonies here at the time. There are now 50 states and a republic. And George Washington was given the role of leading this disparate set of forces that all had their own militias. They'd never trained together. They didn't even have the same uniforms. He pulled them together, but they were heavily outmatched because the British were the most formidable fighting force in the world at the time. And not surprisingly, in the early stages of this war of independence, the American forces were on the back foot and kind of losing rather badly. So he sat down to take stock of this with his senior officers. This has all been expressed in journals from people involved at the time. Apparently, they sat around a campfire and he said, okay, we have to address this question. We're losing right now. We're not winning. Now, here's the question, he said. How can we defeat the British? We've tried this, we've tried that, we've tried the next thing. I want ideas. And the ideas came and people challenged each other, but none of them were practical. Each idea that came up, people said, that can't work because of this or that. And then eventually, after all this intense mental engagement and creative process, somebody said, I think we're asking the wrong question. How can we defeat the British has no good answer. The right question is, how can we avoid losing? And that's the question that won a war, because that gave rise to a whole new strategy of commando raids, surprise raids on the British columns, and rapid withdrawals before taking losses on the assumption, with the expectation that the British would get exhausted and go home. And they did.
Pretty much what happened at the end of the day.
With the help of the French on the final push. Thank you to France. But it was that strategy. Now, there are many other examples of this kind of good question that leads to great outcomes. But that's one that sticks in my mind. And it didn't just come, what question should we ask ourselves? Well, the question is this. It came from a lot of intense engagement and thought and creativity, got the juices going, and then ultimately out pop this breakthrough question, if you like. That's the process of learning.
The leader doesn't necessarily have to have the question. The leader has to create the environment.
Here we are.
And the opportunity for the question to emerge.
Yeah, Washington was the midwife. He didn't come up with the question. One of the others did. He was the midwife that facilitated the delivery of the question.
I didn't know George clearly. I'm not sure he would have loved that analogy. I mean, I'm sure he would have loved where you had it ended, but calling him a midwife, I don't know about that with George.
Exactly. Let me withdraw that comment, George. Yeah.
So I want to ask you a question, because when you write about this, we are in complete lockstep, and I'd like for you to talk about this for a second. The word is priorities.
Yes.
And the question is, how many? How many is the right number? How many is too many?
We all talk about priorities. I sometimes say to people in a seminar, what's more important than your priorities? And they talk about all kinds of things. And I said, look, the answer is nothing. Because if something else is more important, then that's a priority and not this. So this is a big deal. When you say there's nothing more important than this in terms of creating leverage, and it's the 80-20 rule typically, so it's a hard thing. The very, very few, 20% of the strongest leverage points create 80% of the output, right? It's not 50-50. So priorities are pretty important. Now, we have to have shared priorities if we're going to have a winning team. You can't just say to people, these are the priorities, follow them. You have to engage people in it to say, here's our winning game. That comes first. Here are the priorities that help us to succeed. Now, there was received wisdom that was alive and well. Still, in many quarters, I see it happening. People say no more than 5 priorities. Now, there's a whole history about where that came from, and I won't go into that, right? But it gave rise to a kind of a myth that 5 priorities is the right number. You don't exceed 5. And I found something in my workshops that when I was working with a team on strategy, and we came to the time to define the priorities, I say no more than 5. And they get to 3 or 4 and they say, what else is there? What else is there? I'm saying, what a pathetic No, that's not the issue here. The question is what's important, not what else is there. And I realized I was the sinner. I had anchored their thinking on 5. And when once I'd done that, they felt my work's not done until I get to 5. So I began to fret about this. Then I read this tremendous piece of research by a guy called Nelson Cowan from, I think, Missouri State University. A very, very thorough piece of research. And he developed a concept called working memory. Is the number of things we can retain in our minds and function effectively at the same time. And the conclusion he arrived at, and this is pretty rigorous research, is it's 3, maximum 4. 5 is the wrong number. And it's not a linear decline in effectiveness, it's exponential. Yep. So if you go more than 4, it tends to be a wipeout. Now, here's the test, and I've seen it happen. As a leader, you say, okay, this is our winning game. And, as you like to say, well, now what? Well, these are the priorities for success. And if they say, well, it's 1, it's 2, it's 3, it's 4, and where are my notes? You've lost the plot. So the key thing is to have these, I think 3 is great because it's separating the important from the unimportant. That's very hard to do. And if you go to 5, you've copped out on that task. You're saying, oh, well, they're all important. That's just not true. So I'm now urge people 3, maximum 4. And
if you have 5, if you have 6, you have 7, you don't have any.
You don't have any. Literally, you're in the jungle, and you've made a statement that says, "I'm lost in the jungle. I don't know where the hell we are."
We could go this. We go any of 7 directions,
Yes.
and that may or may not. It's probably not going to be the right answer. I'm pretty confident, and having read the book, I was pretty confident this would be true, that you and I could have a long and enjoyable conversation, and yet neither of us have all day. Is there anything that you hoped I would ask, or you hoped that we would talk about that we didn't?
Not really, but I guess if I step back, that you and I can talk about productively, what's the most important task of a leader? It's the most important task of a leader. I have a point of view. I mean, this is not one of these things that I can prescribe and say, this is it and I'm right. Okay, it's a point of view. And I think we all need to have a theory of success. And I think the most important role of a leader is to ensure the continuation and survival of the organization that he or she leads, which means the most important task, and it's a Darwinian imperative, is to create a learning organization that is constantly able to sense and understand the factors in the external environment, where that's where the competition occurs, and then mobilize your internal resources to create the external impact. So be a learning organization, and that's an outside-in task, not inside-out.
Yeah, 100%. I'm going to shift gears before we finish and ask a couple of questions that I ask all of my guests. And the first one is this: what do you do for fun?
I walk and I read a lot. And I love having my dogs with me when I walk. Dogs teach us all kinds of things.
We didn't get there, everybody, but when you order and get your copy of Leadership, The Inside Story, there's a whole chapter about what he learns about leadership from his dogs. So if you are a dog lover, it's one more reason why you need a copy of this book. So you walk and you read. So what are you reading right now?
I read a lot in philosophy. I read a lot in astrophysics and in evolutionary science. So I read a few business books, not many, to be honest with you. I get nourished by these other ideas. I love big history, taking things from the beginning right through the sweep of history rather than 14th century history or British history, whatever it is. And I love the writings of a guy called Harari, I think it is, Yuval Harari. I recommend the book called Sapiens that he wrote. And then he subsequently wrote 21 prescriptions for the 21st century, which I've just finished reading. So those are books that I think would be great for anybody to look at. And then finally, if I can add one more, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's a big book to read, but it's a great read if you want to understand the biases that can sometimes derail our thinking.
100%. I have not read 21 prescriptions for the 21st century, but I have read the other two, and they will all be in the show notes, everybody, for you all, as well as Willie's new book, Leadership: The Inside Story. Where do you want to point people? Where can they learn more about what you're doing? Where can they get the book? Where do you want to point people as we finish up?
Well, the book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble online, and the other retailers that sell books online. It's available from there. And my website has got all the information on my various writings and blogs. It's williepietersen.com. So
if you're watching,
it's all
there. Put it up there. It's Pietersen, Ietersen, Willie Pietersen.com. That's the South African spelling, I presume, to add the I in there. Willie, we'll wrap up here in a second, but you've mentioned it twice. The question that I always ask those who are here, and the question is, now what? Because I promised up on the front end, everybody, that you get the chance to sort of bask in the wisdom of someone who's been there and done that multiple times for many years. And so my challenge to you is, what are you going to take action on from what you got in the last 30 minutes or so? Because if you don't take the action, the value of this drops exponentially. So I hope that you will do that. And Willie, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. I enjoyed our time immensely. And I wish you all the best with the book and everything else.
Many thanks. It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much, Kevin.
And so everybody, we'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Hope you'll be back. Join us. Hit the subscribe button wherever you are hearing this from so you don't miss the next episode. Tell someone else to join us, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much.